So how are you interpreting then the following candle after that large one? So obviously the volume is in the bottom of that candle again, or what would you call it, the point of control?
Yes, the point of control, and it is in the lower end. And again, what's happening here to me, and would you mind if I backed up just a little bit to kind of give you some more perspective? I don't want to make your head spin here, but I want you to get the full effect of what we're looking at and how much depth there is to what we're seeing. Is it okay if I expand on this just a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is exactly what I want to hear. I mean, if I don't know something, I'd much rather say, when I sign up tomorrow, I want to understand what I'm doing.
Well, I understand that. There are a lot of people who are afraid to ask questions, and that generally is where most of the problems come in. So I'd rather have you say that you don't know everything. You'd be surprised how many people don't follow that way. So I'm just going to bring this in a little bit to give some perspective here. Obviously, this morning there was a range that was created in this. This is from about 7:30 to 8 Central this morning. And there was a range. We can see the highs, and we can see the lows, and we can see the highs, and we can see the lows. And so if we just kind of think about what took place before this happened, we can start to put this in a little bit more perspective of why, specifically the question that you were asking about the next candle, why it looks the way that it does. So I want you to think about, let's go back from here, just back another 10, 15 minutes to what happened when we were up at this point. So the way I interpret this, much like the big candle we were looking at, here is that same sort of, there's a lot of volume towards the lower end of it, and the buyers start trying to break away. The issue here is that as the buyers are pushing up, they're banging into the same highs that they've been up against. I mean, obviously in this window of time, the sellers did not want the market breaking out above this. The sellers were coming in and engaging at these highs. And after this move up, that's basically what we see. Now, remember, we're looking at a static period in time. So it's not like we're actually watching this. So I almost need you to be a little bit creative and think about how this period was produced. Because after we had the move up, we had a little pullback and we moved back down. And where did we move back down to? Well, we moved back down to where the buyers had engaged the market, right? Now that's one way of looking at it. But if you think about the open, high, low, and close, that's not how this period came to be. We actually opened and we moved higher. Now, how do I know that? Well, because the period closed down, right? It's a red wick. So I know that if this is the open and this is the close, and it's a red wick, that the price activity that took place here, this is the final product, not what happened at the beginning. So actually what happened is the period opened and the buyers tried to force out of this range. They tried really, really hard. And how do I know that? Because I can see the cluster of trade that took place. That tells me that there was a battle between buyer and seller. I can tell that there was a lot of volume there. And obviously at the top of the range, you're going to have sellers coming in, trying to drive the market back down, and you're going to have buyers trying to break it out. Well, in this case, the buyers lifted up, but were unable to power through. They were unable to produce the event that happened in this period that we were just talking about. Instead, they pushed the market back down. Where did they push it down to? Back to where the last group of buyers were. Then the next period opens. The buyers try again off of the same levels, but they can't penetrate the top. The sellers come back in and drive back down, but just like the buyers, they're unable to break the overall range. And that's where we start to see these gray periods come in, where it's not dominated by a buyer or a seller. It's just what we call a neutral auction. And what that means is that there's no dominating force here. The buyer isn't breaking away from the seller, and the seller isn't breaking away from the buyer. But in the period that we started talking about, everything changes. Why does it change? Because for the first time, we see the buyer actually accelerate through the range. All of the sellers that have been stopping the upward action, the buyers penetrate through, probably on very light volume. Now, I say probably because we haven't opened this up really and looked at it, but we know that the biggest concentration is down here. Now, exactly in this period, the same thing happened here, except that the buyers were able to follow through. So after the large move up, there's a little bit of a retraction, a small retracement in the market, and generally after a strong move, you're going to have that. And it doesn't matter whether you're trading currencies or equities or futures or whatever it is. Usually after a burst of momentum, you'll have a small pullback. And that is the opportunity for the seller to come back in and say, okay, maybe we're going to be able to hold this, and the buyer to finally drive the momentum through. So what we see is a small pullback, and note where it pulls back to. we're almost at the exact same highs, aren't we? So the high here and the low here almost match up perfectly. This is the retracement back into the prior effort, just like we've seen before. And from there, we now establish a base, right? Once the buyer comes back in and expands the market beyond the initial breakout, we've now established a base of where the buyers are going to turn this into a trend. And that's exactly what happens. So think about the effort going from here, struggling to expand it one more time, buying, and then there's this back and forth. Well, they can't penetrate that volume. This is a significant point in the chart where the buyer is saying, this is the new line in the sand. This is our new level of support. And that's where we see the trend begin to work from. So it's not just the initial breakout that we see, it's the follow-through.
So I guess you had mentioned something really quick before, and I want to clarify one thing for myself. A gray colored candle means that the buying and selling was essentially the same, even though the majority of it occurred at one particular point?
Well, it does. I think probably a better way to explain it is to say that what we're doing is we're measuring the reaction from the volume. So as I said, when we have a situation where there are buyers and sellers battling it out, think for a minute of like a poker game where you have two guys playing poker who both think that they have the best possible hand. And they're going to ante up, and then they're going to bet on each side, and they're trying to bring more money into the pot. And then eventually they've got to show their cards, and there's a winner and a loser. Well, trading against the top of a range is very much the same way, in that you have buyers who think it's a good price and sellers who think it's a good price. And the only way to know who's right is to wait and find out, right? Who follows through with more volume in the end and who relents and gives up. When there is a breakaway from that concentration of volume, it's significant and it means something. But when we can't really move away from the volume, it doesn't have the same effect. So if we look at these periods, we can see that the overall cluster of volume, one, as opposed to being 3 or 4 prices like these, we only have a couple of prices here. And what's happened is that there's just not a very large concentration of volume. And on top of that, the buyers aren't able to really break away from it at any point in time. And the same would be true here, where the sellers are unable to really break away from a high concentration of volume as well. So we call that a neutral auction. And the reason we use the word neutral is because there's not any sort of defined winner or loser, but very often neutral auctions lead into a major transition in the market. And this is a good example of that, where we have strong buyers and strong sellers, but they're unable to break a range. And as the volume sort of neutralizes and we get a concentration of less volume and the inability to break away from it, that tells us that somebody is probably going to come in and take control of the market. And so this is a beautiful transition over only a few price levels of the sellers trying, then not really being able to follow through, and the buyers just taking it and running. So when we see gray, we think of it as neutral, but we also think of it in terms of something this could be the beginning of something big.
Okay, that makes sense now.
Well, good. I'm glad that gives you a little bit of clarity.